But it's 10 p.m. now. The time in those other channels tend to tell you what you should be thinking, but this is where you have your chance to speak to the rest of the United Kingdom through GB Views. And last week, the polls closed in the Batley and Spen by-election, with Labour's Kim Ledbetter winning her late sister Jo Cox's former seat by a tiny margin of 323 votes. It wasn't just the photo finish that made this vote like no other. Before a single ballot had been cast, the by-election had been making headlines after being described as one of the most toxic in British political history, with many commentators placing the blame on my guest for tonight's big question. 40 years after beginning his political career as the youngest ever chair of the Scottish Labour Party, George Galloway finished third behind Labour and the Conservatives at Batley and Spen with a sizable 21.9% of the vote, despite only launching his economically radical and socially conservative Workers' Party of Britain 18 months earlier. Though effective, his anti-woke campaign, appealing to the area's Muslim population, which took a tough stance on cancel culture and LGBT sex education in schools, had been branded negative, angry and aggressive by MPs and anti-discrimination groups. George, who was ejected from Labour in 2003 for his vocal opposition to the Iraq War, was accused of using shameful tactics in an open letter from local Muslim women by exploiting anger over Labour's silence on Palestine. Attacks on Labour campaigners, condemned by Boris Johnson as utterly sickening and appalling, as well as on Kim Ledbetter herself, have been attributed to his presence in the race. Now, after announcing he will contest the results of the by-election, which he says was dominated by lazy and fake tropes, George has even been dubbed Britain's answer to Donald Trump. But like with Trump, have the left been too quick to dismiss the former respect leader? While the usual woke publications and commentators have upheld the result as a rejection of the Workers' Party and its policies, after reducing Labour's lead by over 3,200 in the northern stronghold, is this a vote of confidence for George to continue waging war against his former party and Keir Starmer? George, thank you for being here tonight. Look, did you get what you wanted? I would presume not, because Keir Starmer still remains leader of the Labour Party and he didn't lose.
Well, in a party political sense, Keir Starmer being the leader of the Labour Party is the best thing that could happen to us. He's the reason why we have grown exponentially in the 19 months since the party was launched. We have branches from Penzance to Peterhead. We have thousands of members, 1,000 new members in the last 2 weeks alone. And Starmer and the direction he's taken Labour in, and the ineffectual nature of the opposition that he has offered, has left a vacuum, and we are trying to fill it. But if I may, Dan, answer some of the lazy tropes that you repeated, I'm not blaming you for doing so, but they are lazy tropes. In the words of the famous harlot, Mandy Rice Davis, they would say that, wouldn't they? They are the people we were fighting against. There were no attacks on the Labour candidate. That's simply untrue. There was verbal harassment by someone completely unknown to me at the time, although I now realise he was thrown out of one of my public meetings in Dudley Town Hall in 2019.
Just to be clear, are you denying that you had anything to do with the pamphlet that was distributed about the Labour candidate's sexuality? That had nothing to do with you or your campaign?
That would be a defamatory suggestion.
No, I'm just asking the question.
Very well, you know very well that I am not homophobic. And if you don't know it, you can consult my parliamentary record. My parliamentary record so exemplary that in the days when it was worth having, I was given a Stonewall commendation. So it is flatly a defamatory lie to describe me as homophobic. So I don't know what pamphlet you're referring to. I've never heard that referred to before. let alone seen it. But if such a pamphlet exists, if it dealt with my opponent's sexuality, then I absolutely condemn it. This is the problem, you see, Dan. I can't be responsible for everything that other people do that are nothing to do with me or my campaign. I was in the process of explaining to you that the individual who verbally harangued the Labour candidate, which led to the very facts that will be dealt with by the court in due course, had not only nothing to do with me, but had to be physically ejected from one of my public meetings in 2019 in the Dudley Town Hall. He is a campaigner against LGBT education. He's from Birmingham. He was completely unknown to me and said nothing about me in his angry tirade against the candidate. Now, that then became a lie that went round the world before the truth had got its trousers on. The Labour candidate said on television, and everyone, including your channel, repeated it, that I had been laughing on the other side of the road when this was all happening. In truth, I was on the same side of the road, 100 yards away, and on camera, being filmed for television, and therefore could not have possibly been laughing on the other side of the road. This will be a material issue in the court case to overturn the election.
Yes, and I'm going to come to the court case in one moment, George. I'm going to come to the court case in one moment. But there were some words that were attributed to you in a leaflet and also that you spoke about in a speech that have been described as homophobic. So I want you to clarify them. In your speech, you spoke about anal sex a lot, and this claim that anal sex was being taught in schools. Now, anal sex has not been taught in schools, is it, George? And in your leaflet, you said, I will demand parental involvement in the school curriculum. I don't want my children to be taught in a moral vacuum. What were you referring to there?
I agree with that statement, Dan. A lot of people of all ethnicity and all backgrounds believe that parents should have a much greater say, particularly on this very sensitive field of what our children are taught and when they are taught it about sex. Now, I did not speak about anal sex a lot, as you have just said. I said this: I don't want my 7-year-old to be taught about masturbation. Nothing homophobic about that. Secondly,
you said or anal sex.
I don't want my children to be taught that parents chest feed rather than women breastfeed. Nothing homophobic about that. And I said once, not a lot, that I don't want my children to be taught about anal sex. And I don't. Nor vaginal sex.
But they're not, though, are they, George? They're not being taught about that.
By a teacher that I don't know and don't know the moral standing of. So I think
George,
a lot of
are they being taught about that?
Sorry?
Are they being taught about that?
Yes, there are teaching materials that are in circulation that have been widely reported in newspapers that you formerly worked for, which say exactly that. And if they are merely on the drawing board and not yet in the classroom, it's still time to stop them. It's really quite basic. I don't think primary school children should be being taught about sex. And if they are going to be so, I want a say on what they're going to be taught. And a lot of parents watching this on GB News agree with me.
What about the teacher, George? What should happen to him? The teacher that showed the cartoon of the Prophet Muhammad in class. He has been driven from the area. He is too scared to return to his job. You described it as him showing a hate poster in an interview with The Guardian. But what do you think should happen to the teacher now?
Trust me, Dan, I've never given an interview to The Guardian. I have not spoken to The Guardian for very many years and shall never give them an interview or speak to them again. I'm surprised you're praying these liberal rags in aid of this interview, but let me tell you, if I had been the Member of Parliament at the time, this would never have happened. If it had happened, I would have led the response to it and avoided the ugliness that we saw outside the school. And if I had been elected last Thursday, I personally would have walked the teacher back to school. I would have resolved this matter very quickly. Labour, on the other hand, ran away from it and are still running away from it. They left the teacher out to dry, and I'll tell you why. The teacher did nothing wrong. He taught a lesson that had been handed to him from the head teacher, who had handed it to him after the clearance of the local education authority. So this goes up the tree, not down the tree. The teacher himself did nothing wrong. And according to Paul Halloran, the quite well-known independent political campaigner around here, actually there wasn't even an image of the Prophet Muhammad ever shown in the classroom, which, as I said in my speech in Batley Centre, makes you wonder what this was all about.
OK, we've got lots of questions coming in from our viewers, George, so I want to get to them. And John, on the GB News Twitter account, has asked a very relevant one. Are you going to challenge the result in court?
I'm actually in my lawyer's office right now, working on the case.
On what grounds? On what grounds?
Sorry?
On what grounds are you going to challenge it?
Multiple grounds. I'm not sure you've got enough time to hear them all, but the headlines would be the making of a false statement about an opponent in an election, and I gave you the most salient of those, the false statement made by the Labour candidate on television that I had been on the other side of the road laughing when she was being harangued by an Islamist extremist on Kashmir and LGBT matters, when I was on the same side of the road, 100 yards away, and being interviewed.
OK. On any other grounds, George? You've already explained that, but on any other grounds, you're going to challenge the result?
Yes, lots of them. The unlawful taking down of thousands of our election posters 3 days before the poll on absolutely unlawful, bogus grounds. The Labour Party's vast overspend. There was a ceiling on spending in this by-election of £100,000. My reckoning is that Labour bust that at least twice and maybe three
What proof
times.
do you have for that, George? What proof do you have for that?
This is another material aspect, but perhaps...
But what proof do you have for that, George?
Sorry?
What proof do you have for that?
Well, we don't have proof until Labour produces their election expenses, but the court will require them to do so. But the most disturbing for most people was the failure of the returning officer to recount the votes when the majority was less than 1%. The law is very clear that if the margin of victory is less than 1%, there should be a recount of the votes, and there was not. The Conservatives demanded it, it was refused. I demanded it, it was refused. We believe the returning officer behaved unreasonably there. And breaking news, we have video of postal votes. Some of your viewers will remember those from Peterborough and elsewhere. Postal votes, large numbers of postal votes arriving in the dead of night in unsealed black plastic bin bags and being thrown onto the counting table in the early hours of the morning. We have video of that. So there are many other reasons. You don't honestly have time to hear them all, but I promise you our case is much stronger than the Phil Woolas case, which led to the disqualification of the Labour MP Phil Willis.
Okay, well, we'll keep across this. Lots of other questions coming in. Tony on GB Views asks, did Labour seek to capitalise on Jo Cox's death by petitioning her sister to stand?
Well, I think it was a cynical move, but I refrained always from criticising or attacking my opponent for that obvious reason, and I don't want to start now. But there were several local, active, elected Labour people who thought they should have been the candidate and were passed over, and that was one of Labour's problems. See, all of this chaff, Dan, is to hide the fact that I took 22% of Labour's votes. So if it's really being said that I am all these awful ists and obias, then this is really aimed at the 22%, who used to vote Labour, by the way, and were never insulted then, but who came to me in this election.
Got lots more questions coming in. Adrian asks, are you going to tuck in and eat your hat as promised, given Labour didn't finish third?
Well, after the court case, if the election result is upheld, then I guess I'll have to, Dan. If you could provide some, I don't know, Tabasco to make it more palatable, I will.
It's a deal. It's a deal. Pacey.
I'll do it on your show.
Pacey on GB Views asks, did it upset you under Corbyn that Labour became a hotbed for anti-Semitism? And was Labour right to kick out Chris Williamson and Ken Livingstone?
I don't accept the premise of the question at all. There are undoubtedly anti-Semites on the left. If I didn't know that before the Corbyn era, I did discover it, but not many, and not nearly as many as are in the Conservative Party or in golf clubs up and down the country or in other parts of the society. Anti-Semitism is a real thing, but the idea that Jeremy Corbyn was an anti-Semite or Chris Williamson was an anti-Semite is completely false, completely untrue.
And Adrian asks, are you still friends with Jeremy Corbyn?
No, I haven't spoken to Jeremy Corbyn for many years.
Okay. From Josie on GB Views, has intersectionality destroyed politics and left behind the vast majority of the working class?
I don't know about intersectionality. I'm not sure I know what that means, Dan. I'm just a working man in my prime. But I think identity politics has destroyed the Labour Party. The fetishization of race, of sexual orientation, of gender questions, of ethnicity and so on, the endless banging on about these things, to the exclusion, virtually, of class politics, has destroyed the Labour Party and has left a lot of territory for the Workers' Party to cover.